do you want to, should I just,
Yes,
okay,
please.
okay, great. So I am really, really happy to be able to have the Institute in Dr. Reed here, who I've known for quite some time. And he is an absolute leader in behavioral economics. So all of those ideas we've talked about in some journal clubs, I mean, so much a leader. When you say he's written the book, here is the book. This is actually only one of 4 books that he's written. He's, as I say, a leader in his field, and you can see that by, this is how thick his CV is, and there's 170 articles, and there's book chapters, and NSF funding, and he's been on editorial boards because he is just so expert in being able to take these behavioral economic concepts, make them understandable, broaden them to fields where they're not usually used, and I think we're going to see a super example of that today, and also to bring them back to think about policy implications. And I am very excited. Derek is working on a special issue of a journal that does just that, takes behavioral economics and thinks about how behavioral economics can be used to devise policies that will help us in our working life, but also in our personal lives. So I can't say enough awesomeness that.
Well, thank you.
But so now.
Yeah, way to raise those expectations, Susan. We'll talk about that in a minute. So a few things before we get started. Some of this is supported through NSF. That's behind that little icon there. I have some collaborators here that are helping me as I make this career transition. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. But I talked to our sleep scientists, who are Jake and Jamie. And so anything I don't understand, I'm just going to tell you to talk to them. And so don't hold me accountable to it. So my background is a little different. I started at Syracuse University. That's where I got my PhD in school psychology, not related to anything I do now. After working there, I did some clinical work in autism for a few years, and that led me to the University of Kansas. I directed the Applied Behavioral Economics lab there for 13 years. And just this past fall, I left academia and came to Institutes for Behavioral Resources, which I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Institutes for Behavioral Resources is really exciting for me. Personally, I've been working with the president there, Steve Hirsch, for quite a long time. So Institutes for Behavioral Resources is located in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was in Kansas when they hired me, and I've since moved to Colorado. So I work from Colorado for a company in Baltimore. Yeah. What's interesting about IBR is that it's big in 2 areas, and those 2 areas haven't really come together yet. So one of the big things that has come out of IBR is Steve's fatigue model. So it's called safety. And so this is something that's been vigorously researched in peer-reviewed literature. It's calibrated by the Department of Transportation. It's been adopted as a standard warfighter model for the Department of Defense. It's used by U.S. Federal Railroad Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So they use this to look at past accidents and prospectively try to prevent future accidents due to fatigue. And that has resulted in a product that IBR sells called Safety Fast. And so this is building off that fatigue model and basically creating a scheduling tool to help people find the best shift work for their different clients. And so the reason this all works is because it predicts cognitive performance, effectiveness as all these interacting variables. So this is where the sleep stuff comes in that I don't know a whole lot about. And when I agreed to give this talk, I was at KU, and I was going to come out and talk to you about behavioral economics and health policy and public policy. And I decided that I would try to bring in some of my new stuff that I'm doing related to sleep and fatigue, not realizing when I agreed to do that, that I'd be in a room full of experts in the world about that. And so here I am. So the other interesting thing about IBR is that this is primarily what we do. We also have a methadone clinic there. But what's interesting is Steve is a big deal in the fatigue modeling world, but he's also a big deal in behavioral economics. He's actually considered the founder of behavioral economics. As you have heard, Daniel Kahneman passed away last week. He was kind of another huge name in another form of behavioral economics that I'll talk to you about. But those two are talked about as kind of the two founders of the two kind of disciplines within behavioral economics. So the first part of my talk is going to be just a little bit about what is behavioral economics and why is this useful for what I'm going to talk about later. You probably already know about some of this through Suzanne's work and her lab. But I'm going to try to fill in some of the stuff we do with humans that has some translation to what I'm going to talk to you about related to fatigue and sleep research. And this is a new area for me. It's also a new area for our company. So behavioral economics, you probably have heard this term. Obviously, if you work here, you've heard this term. I have behavioral highlighted here because I am not an economist. I'm a behavioral scientist. But when we talk about economics, we think about all sorts of things like accounting and finance, transfer of wealth, labor issues, and that's all part of economics, and that's great. Early on in economics, they actually defined it as a science that studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means that have alternative uses. And economics has kind of transitioned into something beyond that with this very early 1932 quote that I just read to you. That's actually pretty predictive of what we do in behavioral economics. So if you don't know about behavioral economics, here's a quick crash course. So behavioral economics walks away a little bit from the finance aspect and tries to get at what people do. Not at what we think they should do, but what they actually do. So a lot of this comes into irrationality and things that have resulted in lots of popular press books like Nudge, if you've heard of that, it's a New York Times bestseller. Richard Thaler, who worked with Daniel Kahneman, won a Nobel Prize. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for their work in behavioral economics. So it basically has created this term to be a household name if you're in the academic world in any way. Now, there's that flavor of behavioral economics, and I'm going to unpack that a little bit more in a bit, but then there's the very basic side of behavioral economics. And this is where my expertise is, which is in the experimental psychology realm. So I'm going to talk through what that means over the next few slides to try to differentiate the two, but also show how they're related. So this work came about in the late 70s, early 80s, and again, by my mentor and my boss, Steve Hirsch. So when we talk about behavioral economics, we have two ways we can think about it. There's the behavior of economics, which we see up here. If my cursor to work, no. That's somebody counting money. So it's like the behavior of economics, and this is where the economists study behavioral economics. Then we have the economics of behavior. And so here we have a pigeon working. We might work with rats or monkeys or humans. So this is the economics of behavior. There's also the behavior of economics. So it's kind of confusing. Both of these disciplines concern choice under constraint. So we think about what an organism does. Doesn't matter what species it is, but what they do. And so what we do is we look at how they make choices when we control the environment in very specific ways. So they both view humans interacting in their world as dynamic functions of their context. Both assume some integration of economic principles and behavioral psychology, and both are based on laboratory experiments, but also have relevance to fieldwork and just the real world. So I like to think of this as big E economics, very big on the econ side, versus what we do, which is the behavioral side, big B behavioral economics. So big B behavioral economics is what Suzanne's lab does. This is all rooted in this idea of operant behavior analysis. So operant behavior basically implies that we have an organism working on some operanda, so they interact with their environment. Here we have a pigeon pecking a key. What we might do is create cues or some sort of stimulus that controls what they should be doing. So that's just something that we cue in their environment. So in this case, you see that the pigeon has a little picture of a yellow car. So that would be a cue for that pigeon to respond a certain way. We then manipulate the kind of reinforcers that pigeon might have, and we manipulate the kind of schedule on which we deliver those reinforcers. Okay, So the idea here is that we control the context of the world of this organism and what we're studying. Okay. So as we look at these operative behavior, we start to think about this from an economic perspective. Anything we do in behavioral economics is creating an economic system. So we're working with the behavior of an organism. We are controlling the economic system around that organism. We look at reinforcer efficacy and how effective that is, and we measure that using demand elasticity, which is really important. We'll talk about that in a moment. We talk about reinforcers having different cross-price elasticities, so these things interact. So there's a system that surrounds this organism, and you can respond to different contingencies, and those all matter as well. And then the idea here is that when we think about how an organism chooses to allocate its behavior, we're really looking at this from this idea of economic demand in behavioral economics. So economic demand looks a little something like this. So this is a demand curve, and we're going to see some more demand curves. So it's important for me to walk through these data. These are data from a monkey. So what we can look at is how much will that organism work for a reinforcer under minimal constraint. So if it's free or very, very cheap, that's what we call intensity. So that's where that demand curve starts. Then we can look at how fast that consumption goes down as a function of those contingencies. We call that elasticity or alpha. And then we can look at some other variables that are super important. So when we look at this demand curve, what you see is there's a period of time where that price going up doesn't really change consumption. So we call that inelastic demand. And at some point, that consumption starts to go down. The price is just too high and the organism stops responding. And we would call that the period of elastic demand. And that creates a really important part of the demand curve called price max or Pmax that allows us to quantify that change. Where does that change happen to be? Now, I'm an applied scientist, and this variable here becomes really important to me because that's that price that you can directly lead into intervention or policy. So that's the price that we care about. And with that price is we could look at the output of the organism. And what you see is that Pmax is the point at which you get maximum output on that curve. So that's the amount of responses that the organism might be emitting. So this is all talking about a monkey pressing a button or a lever to access food, but we can think about human behavior the same way. So this is paying for alcohol or cigarettes. This would be the total amount of money spent. So the number of cigarettes that you're buying at that price, that's the maximum price at which that happens, which we call Omax, output max. So that's also an important area, which allows us to model certain things. So now I'm going to transition a little bit into human behavior. So there's different ways we could collect data from humans. Early on, what we were doing with humans was very similar to what we might do with a monkey. So here you have a diagram of a very early experiment in experimental behavior analysis. It's just, you see a patient pulling a lever to access, I think this was for cigarettes. And then you have someone filling out surveys online. So those are two different ways. Now, obviously, this is the pure way to do it. So we have people in a little chamber, and we still do this in certain contexts where you might be able to pull this plunger to access puffs of cigarettes, for example. We've transitioned away from that for a lot of reasons. This is still super useful, but I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And as we move into areas that are of really utmost social importance, sometimes it's hard to capture it with a little plunger pull. All right, so here is an experiment that was done by some of our colleagues, and these are human data responding to access cigarettes. And these are actual administrations, so they can earn puffs, pulling that little plunger to get puffs. What's really cool, and what really got me excited with this, is that we can look at other species and we see that the same sort of equation, works equally as well with humans and with monkeys, or pigeons, or rats, or I've seen it with chickens and pigs, and all sorts of species follow the same demand equation and the same principles, which is really cool. So my background, when I was an undergrad, I was an engineering student. And I made a switch my junior year into psychology, and it was there that someone said, hey, there's this area of experimental psychology called quantitative analysis of behavior, where you can engineer and use equations to model what an organism does. And that's what got me hooked into this area. And so what we were doing as an undergrad is we were doing this work, but with cocaine and rats, right? And so early on, that's really cool. It's a very pure way to do science, but there's some limitations of what we can do. So number one, if you're doing this sort of work and you're using these operant chambers where you're pulling plungers or having a rat or a pigeon, it requires actual exposure to and consumption of rewards. If you're working with humans, that becomes a huge nightmare with the IRB, as you might imagine if you're using cocaine or heroin or something like that. Doesn't mean it can't be done, it can. It's just very hard. Number two, one of the reasons we don't often do this is that our best practice in behavioral science is to have steady state responding and extended exposure to an independent variable, which means we take lots of data over time. And we want to be super confident that we understand that behavior, and so we take as much data as we can. So if you're using something like heroin as a reinforcer and you're working with a human, that would require a lot of sessions of administering heroin. So that becomes a logistical issue as well as a feasibility or ethical issue. Okay, as Suzanne will probably admit to you, it's very expensive and hard to maintain operant labs as well. So going back, which I won't do, it's very hard. So if you want to collaborate with outside researchers, you have to be the one doing all the research. It's not as transportable. And so there's certain things we can do. And so then there's also these independent variables that are unethical or infeasible to use with participants. And I'll touch on that in a minute. The good thing here is that we have decades of lab work with various species in behavioral economics in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, which Suzanne is the editor of. So that's kind of what guides all of the work in this discipline. All right, so we have all this to call upon. I mean, that journal started in the 1950s, so it's been around a while. But as we start to look into things that affect humans today, we talk about occupational health and safety, these are sort of issues that we have to come up with. Like, how do we do research on like condom use or access to opioids or heroin or eating cake or drinking beer, smoking cigarettes? These are all things that are very important variables for us to understand as behavioral scientists, but also very hard to study in certain lab contexts. It's not the reality for those users all the time. So a really good example of why we made a transition to doing some of these simulated tasks that I'm going to tell you about comes from the 1980s and 1990s with the smoke cocaine epidemic. There's a bunch of stats, I'm not going to go into those, but you probably are aware that this happened. And during this time, there was a call for proposals to address this. And so behavioral economists got together, Warren Bickel and Steve Higgins, people that we know quite well, and they created a way to do this with humans to try to understand this. And early on, they were doing the plunger pulls, the presses, and people were administering the drugs, self-administering the drugs, which is also dangerous in its own respect. But out of that work, Jacobs and Bickel came up with a procedure that would try to simulate this. And so they published this, and it kind of changed the game for what we do in terms of human behavioral economics. So they came up with a way to study this using simulated procedures. So, yes?
So in the examples you're currently using, these are addictive substances. And so how does the model then have to completely shift if what you are giving as a reward is non-addictive?
No, and that's what actually really excites me as a quantitative person, is the model seems to explain quite well any consumatory behavior if you set it up in this sort of arrangement. So you're within subjects studying across this varying prices, all of that. I'll show some work in a little bit that kind of touches on how this would happen. But we've done it in my career at University of Kansas. Most of what we did was not actually administration of drugs, nor was it necessarily consumable substances. Yeah, so I'll return to that in a moment. So what they came up with was a very long vignette, which we've narrowed down, but where they actually used what we know from the field of verbal behavior. So there are certain things we can do to control responding and to get people to all think the same way. So if I were to ask you, like, how many beers would you buy if they were $5? You'd probably start to think, well, it depends, right? Like right now versus Friday night, am I with my friends, am I at a bar, all these sort of things. So we need to control for that. So we have to paint these vignettes, and sometimes they get a little out of control. Like this one's quite long. We don't usually use one this long. But they built in things that we know control behavior based off of decades of non-human lab work. So what we can do is say, like, you can buy as much or as little as you like. So what we're going to do here is manipulate what we know about budgets and supplies. Or we'll say, assume that you're not in treatment, you're not getting all these other substances. So what we're doing here is calling on things that we know from economics, like substitutes and complements, what we know can control consumption. So if you're thinking, well, I have a bunch of beer at home, why would I buy any beer right now? We have to control for that in our vignette. And then equally important with that is you're not going to get this anytime else today. So what we're doing is what we say, closing the economy. Right? And so this is not arbitrary. A lot of people say, well, this is just survey work. It is kind of like a survey, but a lot of thought goes into these various controls. So we can isolate the effects of the price, for example, or the context, where we might vary some of the words. And what we see here is these are data from that study where you get very lawful demand curves that, the equation predicts quite well. So this seems to work. And there's been a number of meta-analyses published actually pretty recently showing that hypothetical versus actual consumption correlates. So even though we're measuring something people say they would do, it actually does map onto what they do. So that's important. So this evolved into a whole technology that we call the hypothetical purchase task. And this has become kind of the standard by which we look at abuse liability for drugs with humans in today's world. What I really like about this paper is they looked at a whole range of different commodities. So here we have a roll of toilet paper. And this was not to be funny, it was they wanted a survey that any human being could take this and they have some experience purchasing this and it wouldn't be out of the room. So like bottles of water, some people don't buy bottles of water, they're against that. But rolls of toilet paper seem to be a kind of a ubiquitous necessity for humans. And so they actually studied that and were able to show systematically that the effects are what they should be. So this hypothetical purchase task seems to work well with varying commodities. So we've actually started a transition, and where I'm going to go with this in the latter part of my talk, is looking at things related to policy. So what we've started to do is try to look at experimentally manipulating things that you can't easily do in the real world. So for instance, warning labels on drugs. Like we could simulate that in a task. It would be very hard to do that in reality and measure things the way we would want it to. Having extended exposure to warning labels, like that doesn't seem to add up. We've looked at things like excise taxes on ultraviolet indoor tanning. That was published in JM. Happy hour policies. So we did a study looking at buy one, get one free versus half price alcohol. And what's interesting with that one is that when we looked at the literature, there wasn't much work on what happens with happy hour policies. So for one of my students' dissertations, he kind of threw this in as a little manipulation, but I ended up being an expert witness in the case in Virginia with the Attorney General because we were the only people who had done this study, which surprised me, and it was just a survey, so whatever. But interesting. Medication side effects, how we frame those. Again, not something we can easily do in reality and measure it in the field. Next day responsibilities, so imagine you have to work the next morning, how much alcohol would you consume? Dosage regulation, commute times, drug packaging, all of these things have been studied using hypothetical tasks and have led to a number of policy changes. And so one of the things that we've started to do is use Altmetric Explorer. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a way that you can look at how various academic papers have been cited or used. And some of that links to public policy. And what's really neat is that we're seeing a lot of this work, hypothetical purchase tasks, now finding their way into citations in government documents and policy, which is cool. So this has led to us really writing some best practice pieces on what does it mean to inform public policy using behavioral economics. So that's where my expertise is, and that's what I'm interested in doing. Making this change to IVR and working with a company that does a lot of fatigue research has caused me to start to think a little bit more deeply about some issues. One of the things that we came across with a student's dissertation last year before I left the university has to do with thinking about time being a commodity that we all have, we can all consume, and it's like the ultimate closed economy. And if you think about this old aphorism that time is money, you probably heard that. That's behavioral economics. Like that, you're making a trade of your time for money in some way. In one of the earliest papers on behavioral economics, Lee actually wrote a great passage that really stuck with me. Time as the fundamental and irreplaceable human resource ought to be used as a common currency in economics, thus making it possible to deal sensibly with choice between priced and non-priced items. Not everything has a price on it. We could try to figure out a way to put a price on it, but that's hard to do. So when I got to IVR and they did a lot of work with fatigue and sleep and measuring people's kind of value of that, that led us to think about how could we devise an experiment where we could look at the cost of sleep, essentially. How much is time sleeping worth to you? So the basic framework of this, and I think the cool take-home point to this comes from the safety model that Steve developed. Steve's model was basically validated using the sleep dose response study, which you probably are familiar with if you're in this field, where they actually manipulated the amount of sleep people had. And so Steve was at Walter Reed when they were doing this work, so he was involved with it. And so basically people had different amounts of sleep that they had controlled over a series of a week. And what they did was they measured performance on a performance vigilance task. So basically responding to a stimulus on the screen and how fast and accurately they could do that, looking at lapses, looking at speed. So as a behavioral scientist and experimental psychologist, that's really cool to me because this is the way I would have designed it. So they have these really good data, parametric manipulation, where we can see the effects of different amounts of sleep and the impact on fatigue and efficiency and effectiveness. So, and again, we can look here at number of lapses. So this really helped inform Steve's safety model. This is where this is not my area. So I'm gonna just say, you can look at this, and this is the safety model. People here probably know what this stuff is. I don't. So I'm gonna have any hard questions, just direct them to our sleep scientists. But the idea here is that this sort of underlying model is what's gonna drive some of our interpretation of the data that we collected. So, all right. So the idea is here, how do we measure someone's choice between working overtime and getting more money or sleeping? And that's kind of the general framework. So for this study, we went to Prolific. Prolific's an online crowdsourcing service. Amazon Mechanical Turk was kind of the area that people tended to use for a long time. Prolific's kind of emerged as what academics seem to be using now. And so we set up this 2x2 design. And this is where I think there's going to be a lot of cool overlap with work you're all doing, as well as like what we're interested in doing. So one of the manipulations we had was whether or not people self-described their enrollment in Prolific and their job as having a safety procedure. So to be included in our yes safety precautions group, they had to endorse one of the following. My job sometimes involves compliance with the safety procedure. I follow safety procedures every day, or almost all my job tasks are guided by safety procedures. So when anyone signs up for Prolific to take surveys for money, they have to fill out this kind of comprehensive survey of just everything under the sun. And then researchers can recruit from those samples without actually having to ask the question. So that you can kind of keep your experimental question blinded from the participants. They don't really understand what you're getting at per se. So this is what they reported when they became Prolific workers. So no or yes to the safety precautions. So then the other area that we manipulated from this 2x2 was socioeconomic status. And for that, we use the MacArthur ladder scale. And you can, we group them into high or low based on where they fell. And so Prolific again administered this. So we didn't collect the data directly, but this is used across all sorts of studies now, where the worst off is the bottom rung on here. And what's really cool with this is I'll actually, if you're not familiar, they tell participants at the top of the ladder are people who are the best off, those who have the most money, most education, and best jobs. At the bottom are the people who are the worst off. Those who have the least money, least education, worst jobs, or no job. Place an X on the rung that best represents where you think you stand on the ladder. And so what's neat with this procedure, the reason I like it, is that it's subjective. It's not just using someone's financial information, which is what we did for a long time. Like, what is your salary? And then saying, okay, now we're going to group you in a socioeconomic status. But depending on where you live, that salary can mean lots of different things. So this is a little bit more subjective. And so what we did was we took the top 3 rungs versus the bottom 3 as our low and high SES. So the number of people we had per group, for a study like this, it's a fairly big study. In the realm of like safety world, probably pretty small. So we had 100 people in that group, 88 people in this group, and I will say we had a very hard time trying to get to 100. We ended up stopping data collection. So these were high SES people who also endorsed having safety precautions in their job. So I find that interesting in and of itself, that we couldn't get up to 100. 110 people in that group and 100 in this group. And so we just try to balance things out. So just looking at some of the data right off the bat, we were trying to predict or account for the Piskey global score, so the Piskey sleep scale. And what we saw here is that we had an effect of SES, where we had significant differences, which is not, huge news to people in this room, but also in terms of their rating of the importance of good night's sleep. That was just a subjective question that we asked. So that was interesting. So the groups did differ with relation to that. That wasn't really what we're interested in. Like, that's not novel findings. So here's our vignette. So this is the crux of what we were doing as behavioral economists. So I'll let you read this, but it's essentially painting a picture of, imagine you're in this job you really like, and you're offered the opportunity to work overtime. You normally work a 10-hour shift, and you can work for the next 6 days, yada, yada, yada. And what we did is, within subject, manipulated the amount of overtime pay. And so, just as a visual, we would say you regularly work 10 hours. We told them that, imagine you have 4 hours of commute and just other incidental time. That gives you an extra 10 hours here to allocate between overtime and sleep. So you have to account for those 10 hours. So you could, in this case, say I work 2 hours of overtime, which means I only have 8 hours to sleep left in the day. And then this version over here, if you wanted to work 6.5 hours of overtime, you're basically then saying I'm only going to sleep 3.5 hours. So we did this in the purchase task framework. So within subject, every participant filled out how many hours they would work and sleep at each of these overtime wages. So here are the data. So it's really neat to me as a behavioral scientist and someone with a quantitative background is this allows us to precisely model certain things. And so what we did here is there's a dotted line that shows you the 4-hour mark. So what is the price, or what is the wage associated with you reducing down 4 hours of sleep across these different groups? So these are color coded and with symbols. And I'll give you a little bit of a preview here. Regardless of SES groups, so whether it's green or purple, the open triangles, so the no safety group, they're actually they require more money to give up sleep. So think about that in the reverse. If you're someone endorsing that you have safety procedures at work, you're actually willing to give up sleep at a lower wage. That's very problematic to us, and we don't understand it. So I'm going to pose that to you all to think about. Here it is off the log scale. So in demand curves, we usually look at log scales. But just to illustrate, the hours of sleep is still on the log scale, but to illustrate the huge difference here, this is off the log scale. So we're seeing around $40-ish. The people in the safety low SES group are willing to go down to 4 hours of sleep, whereas in the no safety low SES group, it's taking about $60. In our safety high SES group, they're requiring almost $110. And then the no safety high SES group never got to 4 hours. So like it didn't, the amount of money, this is on the average, the amount of money was never high enough for them to dip down low enough. So that's interesting too. Again, not super novel findings, but what's novel here is the procedures and the methods and the way we can look at the data. But we are really unsure how to interpret this, especially with the idea that the safety people are saying that they would need less money to give up sleep. And we don't know what to make of that. So people in this room might be able to comment on that. There might be, our working interpretation is that perhaps people interpret having safety precautions at work as a, kind of rails against doing this, like safeguard. So I could give up sleep because I have safety precautions. I don't know. That's our working. We have to do more research, obviously, to parse this apart, but it's interesting. So if we look at Pmax, so I told you about that earlier on. So we can model what Pmax is for each person, so that point at which they shift from inelastic to elastic demand. And we try to predict that in ANCOVA. The two things that come out as being the significant predictors of that are SES and safety. Now, again, one is in the wrong direction of what we were expecting. So it's not necessarily wrong, but it was unpredicted. What's interesting now is the interaction was not significant. So that's interesting. And so this is after accounting for all these other things like night shift schedule, naps per week, importance of midnight sleep, PISKI, so on. So SES and safety seem to really be driving the bus here. So here they are, just aggregated differently, just to illustrate and kind of drive the point home. We have an effective SES. So higher SES, as you might not be surprised, would require more money. Now, one of the things to us, though, is that this is a health inequity issue. So having more money means you have the luxury of not being tempted to give up sleep because of your job asking you to do overtime. The fact that the purchase task is sensitive to this is also really cool as a technology for methods. We would hope that that would be a manipulation that would cause a difference. There was a voice that was someone speaking over. All right. And so what we have across the top here is the significance level at each price in terms of where the groups differ. All right. And then here's the no safety versus safety. Not a huge whopping difference. Now keep in mind, this is a log scale, so there is a lot of difference the further you get out here. But here we see that effect, but the no safety group actually isn't as swayed by the overtime wages as the safety group. Again, not sure how to interpret that. When we look at this collectively, we think about the data, this is just the original data. One of the things that I started thinking through is like, what does this mean in the real world? What does this mean when I think through SES and safety as contributors to people's willingness to give up sleep for money? Well, these are job ads from the Portland area. And I was like, well, what would it take to get around $45 to $50 an hour of overtime? That's what we're talking about. Well, these are jobs that pay about $30 an hour in the Portland area. These are pretty important jobs. Truck drivers, school bus drivers, chemical operators. So time and a half for these individuals would get them in that spot where they're willing to give up 4 hours of sleep a night. Now, this is all based off of going out a full week. So that's problematic. Now, using Steve's model, I don't have the slide for this, a week's worth of 4 hours of sleep is akin to impaired driving due to alcohol. So it's a BAC of about 0.08. And so that's a way to kind of frame this in real world views. All right. So obviously there are safeguards in place in policy. So for instance, the FAA has, policies related to this. The federal government has a lot of different ways we can do this. So Federal Railroad Administration has different things. You can read them if you want. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has guidelines. So it does control for this in a policy perspective. Even nuclear plant workers have requirements on how much rest they can get. But what's really interesting, though, is, as a lot of you probably know, there are a lot of professions that don't have policies related to this. One of those areas is the medical industry. Doctors, nurses, they work a lot of long shifts. And if you think about like a surgeon, that's, that can be really problematic. So obviously more research needs to be done, and partnering with people here would be awesome to really dive into this. So despite some of the caveats, here are some contributions. This allows us to look at potentially informing policy decisions, target interventions for vulnerable populations, shed light on economic inequalities, their relation to health, And as a technology for the purchase task, I think this is really important to be able to show that, is that we can now use this as a tool for bigger, better projects. So this was a pilot project just to see if we could get something usable. And we think we have something usable, but we need to take this to the next level. One of the areas we're interested in is looking at informational interventions. So showing them a graph of what cumulative sleep deprivation does to performance and seeing if that then changes their behavior on the purchase task. That's a way to go to see if that's meaningful at all. Is there an interaction there with people who work in a safety industry? The safety industry piece is really complicated though. So what does it mean to say that they have a safety precaution in their job? Like, is this a school teacher who has safety precautions and the kid vomits? Or is this someone working in an ambulance, right? So like these are very different job types with very different expectations and outcomes if you engage in unsafe behavior. So we need to unpack that a little bit more. One of the areas that would be great is going to in-person research with this so that we can really isolate the industry, but also ask some qualitative stuff about what's going on. All right, I'm gonna change gears a little bit just to tell you about another angle where we're taking this, and this is the area of sleep and autism. So people don't really know of me as an autism person. All my work that Suzanne talked about is really outside of autism and in behavioral economics, but I did do a clinical internship in an autism treatment facility, 2 years as a clinical director in an autism school. I am a neurodivergent affirming behavior analyst. I have a son with autism. I'm very much involved in the autism world. I've written 2 books on autism. So this is something that's really passionate to me, even though that was like a lifetime ago in academia. But I always point this out to people. One of my first demand curve study I ever did was with a child with autism and looking at different reinforcers that we could use in their academic intervention. And it turns out gushers are the most inelastic demand. So at the time. All right. So looking at sleep and autism. So I've known about this for a while, and having lived experience now, this really is meaningful to me. Obviously, we know the rates of autism are very high, but what I didn't know is that sleep disturbances are a lifelong condition in autism. And when we look at the prevalence of sleep disturbances, 60 to 80% of children and 50% of adults with autism have sleep disturbances. I will just caveat, I will go back and forth and say person with autism versus autistic person, because there is conflicting preference in the autistic community about what that means. So that's not just accidental. I'm trying to go back and forth with that language. So just so you know. And then in children, sleep disturbances significantly predict next day clinical symptomatology. And a very famous paper that it's cited a ton in the autism sleep industry is related to sleep disturbances and activity responsibilities. A behavior analyst who does the work like I do co-authored that paper. And one of their really interesting discussion points was that sleep disturbances reduce the dosage of intervention that we're giving these kids. And I know as a payment provider, behavioral services for children with autism is very expensive unless you have really good insurance. So this is a huge industry, and all these insurance waivers happening and lots of big money being involved, and we're not addressing sleep disturbances, so these kids aren't fully getting what we are paying for. So that's a problem. And then the other thing that I think is interesting from an occupational safety perspective is that we're seeing more and more autistic adults entering the workforce because of decades worth of advances in behavioral intervention, creating independent lifestyles and so forth. But these are people entering the workforce with significant histories of sleep and fatigue issues. And so now they're either choosing jobs where that's not a safety precaution, or they are going to work with these issues. So we did a really quick just kind of survey to see what we would get if we research autistic adults. So we used Prolific because, again, you can filter out people with diagnoses and whatnot. And when you look at the literature, there's not a lot of research on autistic adults at all. And so we wanted to just try to get an idea of what the data say. And so we had 99 autistic adults, 109 non-autistic adults. But I will say what I found really fascinating and very troubling is that when you start to try to filter out known contributors to sleep problems, like anxiety and depression, if you try to find an adult with autism who does not have depression or anxiety, you basically can't. Like we went from having about 800 participants of autistic adults. If you turn these on as filters, like they don't have depression and anxiety, you're down to like 80 people. So that's a really troubling statistic in and of itself. And so we wanted to control for that in both populations. So here we have comparison of autistic and non-autistic adults on all our non-sleep variables. So our controls, the non-autistic, were significantly older by 5 years. Should have controlled for that, I guess. Sexuality is an interesting one. You get more diversity in sexuality in the autistic adults. We had significantly worse depression, significantly worse anxiety. Even though they all had anxiety and depression, it was significantly worse for the autistic adults. All right, so what happens if we do an ANCOVA with our PISCI overall score as our outcome variable? The only thing that pops out of here as being significant is depression. And so again, not huge, exciting news. We know depression is linked to sleep problems, but most of the research that's been done with autistic adults hasn't covariated out depression and done this in this controlled manner. So this is a contribution in that sense. All right, and then this is just breaking down the PISCI into the subscales, which I know you're not supposed to do the sleep scientist form and shouldn't do that. But here they are on the different ones, just so you can see. So anything that's significant means that the autistic adults have worse issues in that domain. So one of our interesting things that we wanted to do, though, is look at demand for data on sleep via wearables. So IBR, where I work, we have a proprietary device that we own all of them. They're called the Zulu watches. Those are really cool. They give you like a good estimate of sleep data. We use it with our pilots. We wanted to see like our sleep problems predictive of demand for data on like sleep variables off your wearable watch, your actigraph. So we also did blood oxygen levels as a control, just to see if like maybe I have demand for just all biological health data. And this is something that IBR has gotten really into in the last few years, which is actually doing behavioral economic analyses of technology that we could put onto the market. To look at features like what does a wearable watch need to do in terms of its features for people to be willing to pay for it and buy it so that they could get out there. So anyways, long story short, there were no differences in anything, so I'm not going to spend too much on these data, but now we know. But the only takeaway from this is that this population, depressed, anxious adults, regardless of autism, are willing to pay a fair amount of money for a device that gives them access to unique data. So that's interesting, I suppose, but we already know that given the prevalence of Apple Watches and Fitbits and so on. So just, in closing with this, I'm going to have one more final thing before we close out here. 89% of our autism sample had problematic sleep on the PISCI, 80% of controls. All right. If we look at the AST sample, they had significantly worse overall sleep on the PISCI, with significantly worse sleep on 4 of the 7 subscales. Worse anxiety and depression in our autism sample, which again hasn't been covariated in the sleep studies that we found, the surveys, and depression was the only significant association with PISCI after you account for everything. Group status was not significant. But what we know is that there's a lot of things we can do to treat sleep, and in my discipline of behavior analysis, we focus on children a lot. We've basically largely ignored autistic adults. But this suggests that we maybe should be translating our sleep interventions for the adult population, and that could increase quality of life. So the next area, and this is just like where we're going with some of this work, and this is like one of my closing slides, is looking at the whole family package. There's really little literature on caregiver sleep problems in families of children with autism. As we might expect, the literature out there shows that the more disrupted the child's sleep, it doesn't matter if it's autism or not, the parent's sleep is also compromised. There's enhanced anxiety and sleep problems in caregivers of autistic children. So there's that. But there's not been good studies on this. So existing studies have used self-report, or they were done 20 years ago. So what we're trying to propose in some very recent proposals to autism foundations is to increase our objectivity in our measurement. So using wearable devices, using pads under the mattress for the kids, can't really wear a wrist device with children with autism who might have severe self-injury. So there's some issues there. Planning to use some machine learning to look at the associations between nights of disrupted sleep and then next day clinical outcomes. And then also looking at parents' sleep and clinical outcomes over time after we treat the child's problems. So that's a proposal we have outstanding, so we're hoping to hear back on that soon. So in closing, the sort of work we do, what excites me about it and why I'm so passionate about it is it offers a unique insight into various dimensions of how people make choices or value things. Demand curves in particular are cool because it provides immediately objective, quantifiable markers that we could actually use as solutions to issues. As we look at this from like what we can do as like a company, fatigue is a major consumer market. Like half our revenue comes from our fatigue scheduling tool. There's a huge autistic community out there who would really benefit from taking advantage of this technology. So like our long-term goal is to try to figure out ways where we can translate fatigue scheduling software to work with children with autism and so forth. So all of these things I think have a really unique opportunity for some interaction, some collaboration, and some translation down the road. So with that, I will end things there and open it up to discussion or comments or questions. Thank you. A whirlwind of stuff, sorry.
So I'm very intrigued by this trade-off between sleep and overtime work and pay. And I'm just thinking about companies that are probably already doing this, right? Like Uber's probably got 100 data scientists that are figuring out how much you have to pay Uber drivers to stay awake and how to keep the price low enough to keep partygoers out and not going to sleep.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
interesting.
Not just, spending work time, but also the choices that people make when they have free time to put in extra work.
Yeah.
Goals online. So, this idea of what do you do when you have these long free days?
Yeah. It's interesting because it's given me a lot of conversation starters with my Uber and Lyft drivers because I asked them about this. And I tend to take really early morning flights, and a lot of them choose to do that. And there's a very good behavioral economic solution of I get paid a lot more per ride. And so I can get up at 3 in the morning, work for 5 hours, make as much as I'd make working 10 hours driving during the day. So it's interesting that they're making those trade-offs. And I'm with you, I'm sure there are behavioral scientists doing this. But yeah, I have not reached out to them yet. Yes.
I think very interesting and innovative to conduct experiment using data collected from prolific. It's getting common using prolific, Qualtrics, MTurk.
Yeah.
And then very innovative to see doing experiment instead of just survey collection. But I would say for my own research, I see a little bit concerned only collect data from one source.
Yes.
And that's a paid platform participants.
Yes.
So,
They're not a random sample.
yeah. And then my question would be, have you controlled for the industry type or job type? That's one thing. For blue collar versus white collar participants, the precaution in terms of safety can be quite different. Another question would be, did you control for the pay scale, their salaries? For people making minimum wage versus $100 an hour, they are willing to sacrifice their hours, 3 hours for pay. That can have different meaning as well.
Right.
So
I'm fairly certain we did not control for industry, but I think we controlled for salary, and that did not equal out to anything. But prolific's weird, as you said. Like these are people who often do this on top of their job. These are people who have the means to do online surveys, so they've got a laptop with a good internet connection. They're pretty sophisticated with technology. So again, like these are all painting a picture. If you look at the demographics of crowdsourced workers, they're highly educated. They tend to be lean, very liberal, and what was the other one? Just their like political and religious beliefs are all very homogeneous as well. And so it's not a random sample of people, absolutely. So yeah, as a pilot, I think this is useful, but this is where we really need to reach out and partner with people because as a company, like all we basically have access to are pilots, which are interesting, but that's a very weird group of people from a safety precaution world. They make good money. Yeah, there's safety, but they are flying a plane and just sitting there for most of the time up in the air. So, versus, and I talked with Nicole about this earlier, like versus firefighters, like, and again, very big public health or safety issues there, but a very dynamic job where you could be on call any second. Like we've done work with astronauts. I haven't, but our company has, who are trying to train for like this International Space Station. And these are people who need to like wake up and deal with a crisis, same with a firefighter or EMT or anything like that. So like these are very specific industries. So these data might be specific to industry, but the fact that we are getting those main effects despite all those covariates is interesting. But we want to unpack that more. And that's the safety issue with people who say that they have a safety procedure at work. Them requiring less money to give up sleep is weird. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but to me, that's a troubling finding.
You can use Prolific to collect data from blue collar only or industry specific, or choose only the high risk industry for your experiment.
That's a good idea. Yeah, we thought about doing military for some other stuff because that's a selection. The variables on Prolific are great if you've not used it, but yes.
Well, just on the last point, I'm imagining that people who have to do monotonous tasks and have a safety
Yeah,
component to it would fail much more easily than like a doctor who has to wake up and maybe have to act in the correct way, make good decisions for a short period of time. And they probably think they can
Yeah.
get away with it,
right.
but they're going to crash. And like the pilots, they need to be awake and alert for takeoff and landing. And like you said, then they're doing nothing.
Right. Right.
So I'm imagining that, if you interview individuals, the characteristics of the type of work that they have to do, if it's long periods of high vigilance versus short periods, I bet the responses or the risks would be different. That they tolerate would be different.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. It made me think of like, be interesting to do this with just factory workers who are just sitting in a spot in the assembly line where it's vigilant but not like life-threatening either. Like if I mess up, right, I might get docked on my pay a little bit, but no one's gonna die. So like the outcomes and like the expectations are different too. So yeah, very much agree. Yes.
So as a follow-up to Matt's question, concerning your data on the choices that people are making to have sleep deprivation versus then a financial incentive, it seems to me that your data could potentially be used by employers to be exploiting lower socioeconomic classes. And so I'm just wondering, you certainly believe the data, but then to prevent that from then further subjecting people to maintaining a lower socioeconomic status, because if the price point is much lower, then they just basically say, well, we can tweak this a tiny bit and, have people to lose half of their sleep. So how do you avoid the exploitation of that type of data to, continue those types of socioeconomic problems?
We've run into this across all the areas of this sort of work, especially like the drug use literature as well, where sometimes you find like, oh, people are, willing to pay a lot more than what we're already charging. So like you could charge, like there's SES issues there as well. So we try to, like these data would not be published as is. We want to do intervention work to show how you can move that so that the focus of the paper will be that. But it's always rough with these demand curve studies, is that the data can be used in very malicious ways. Even with if you think about that original work function where you see how much people are willing to spend, like I always, when I teach this stuff, talk about, if you're working on one side of that curve versus the other, there's public health ramifications of, I'm reducing the amount of people using this drug by charging more, so that's good. But if I go to the other side, I'm making almost as much revenue, but I'm getting a lot of people to do it. And that's the dangerous side. And it's very hard to control for that. But yeah, I don't have a good answer. Yes.
You concluded with a statement about fatigue being a significant consumer market. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
I just mean the sense that, especially with the autism world, parents are hungry for solutions. And I'm not saying to make money, I'm just saying like there's demand out there and there's not anything in that market. So the nice thing about where I work is it's a nonprofit. And so it's not a for-profit company. So a lot of what we do is like public good stuff, and it's just part of our philanthropy, which is one of the only reasons I would leave academia is to go somewhere like that, given my background. And so a lot of what we do is provide free resources and stuff. And so like, I'm not saying we can make money on this. Someone certainly could. But mostly that there is a huge demand in that so many people are struggling with this and are looking for solutions. And we haven't really filled that market yet in any capacity.
I mean, obviously, there's lots of pharmaceutical solutions to
Yeah.
this, and a lot of people are making a lot of money off that.
Yeah,
And then there's, these smart devices. And we had somebody come within the last year that showed that a lot of these smart devices actually don't track sleep well. Do people remember that?
Yeah.
So people are spending a lot of money
Yeah.
to understand their sleep. But that doesn't help you solve the problem of fatigue. You know
No,
what I mean? Like,
right.
you don't sleep well, or okay, I have this much REM sleep and then what?
Right.
Anyway, it's an interesting question because I do think fatigue and insomnia are rampant and
Yeah.
there is people don't know what to do about it. I mean, individuals.
Yeah, yeah. And certain industries are certainly, more ripe for problems than others. And again, I know from being on both sides of the behavior therapy for children with autism, there's been a push for people taking on more clients than they can handle because of the pay. And so our field hasn't caught up to that yet. And so that's where having some of these data and enforcing policies at the insurance level or whatever could be very helpful for consumer protection. And some of these industries just haven't caught up to that yet. And it's very, very scary to think about. Yeah. Yes.
The whole time you were talking, I was thinking of Las Vegas.
Yes.
And I was thinking about experiments and the size of bets that people use and thinking, okay, the roulette table is probably the best game to study because the odds of winning are identical, but the time of the night, they keep the lights dim, as if it's like one of our experiments in the circadian lab.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I mean, not funny. Last week, I was in Vegas for a conference, and it was the Association for Behavior Analysis International Autism Conference held at Caesar's Palace. And
you got it all right there.
yeah, and to me, it was like, okay, this is the least inclusive environment for the autistic community to come to a conference in terms of stimulation and all of that. And also, like as a field, we know about gambling. I guess what we do research in, and it's just very odd that they had a conference there. But I'd never been to Vegas before, and that was something.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if there's like a data set. It's probably secret, but all of the casinos know something about this that we don't know.
Yeah. One of my collaborators is a gambling researcher, and I asked him, he was in Vegas, and I asked him if he's like banned from certain casinos. And he said he is, because there were some staff there who were giving him some of those data, and they found out. Person got fired, now he's banned from the casino. So, but yeah, that does happen, but they're very, very, they don't let that get out. They don't want it to get out, so. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Need an insider.
What the clock? Yeah, thank you.